Mom, Emily wants this trip to be family only. The message lit up in the middle of my screen, short, sharp, and cold, like a blade cutting through a quiet morning. I held the phone so long that my fingertips went numb. The room around me turned into nothing but an empty space, as if someone had quietly pulled all the air out of the house. I stood in the living room. The suitcase was packed, my coat folded neatly on the chair. Sunlight poured through the curtains, brushing against the handle of my suitcase, glinting like a promise about to be kept. Then came the silence. Only the ticking clock remained, and the faint scent of mint from the tea that still lingered in the air, but now that sweetness only made my throat dry. Outside I could hear children laughing, Grace, Ben, and Emily's voice calling out, hurried, "Ryan, come on, we're going to be late!" I stepped onto the porch. The black SUV was already waiting, trunk closed, suitcases lined up. Ryan glanced toward my window. Our eyes met for just a second, long enough for me to see it. In his gaze, I had become something awkward to mention. The car door shut. The engine started. A strip of sunlight flashed across the window. Then the car rolled down the dusty road. No one looked back. The wind stirred, brushing the curtain aside. On the table, the cup of tea still steamed, a thin wisp rising slowly, dissolving into the air like a soul learning how to leave. If you've ever had a morning like mine, when a single message was enough to make the world go silent, stay with me. Because this isn't just a story about a mother left behind. It's about how a heart learns to stand again when love no longer waits ahead. My name is Nora, and this is the story of how I found my way back, through the things I thought I'd lost and the words I never got to say. If somewhere in these moments you see a shadow of yourself, subscribe so we don't lose each other on the road back to peace. Morning in Willow Creek was so still it felt as though the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for summer to begin. Sunlight slid through the pine trees, scattering warm gold across the porch. I poured myself a cup of mint tea, the steam fogging the small kitchen window where my reflection looked back. A 62-year-old woman trying to fold away her excitement into what should have been an ordinary day. On the kitchen table lay a handwritten list I'd made the night before. Things to bring: sunglasses, straw hat, light jacket. Beside it was a ticket for a cruise departing from Lake Michigan. I, Nora, 62, was thrilled about the trip with Ryan, Emily, and the kids. For the first time in years, I felt like I was finally going to be with them. Not just in voice, not just through the pauses of a phone call, but as a whole family again. The beige suitcase lay open on the bed. I folded a white dress with lace trim, the one I'd worn on my last vacation with Ethan. I hesitated for a moment, then laid it at the bottom of the case, as if tucking away a piece of memory. Next, I pinned a small photo of Grace and Ben to the pocket of my blouse, just to make sure, somehow, they'd come along with me. I took a sip of tea. After raising my son alone all those years, I thought I knew what loss felt like, and that I'd grown strong enough to withstand it. But the thing that made me happiest today wasn't the cruise or the getaway. It was hearing my son call me Mom again, naturally, without hesitation. I'd waited for that longer than anyone could imagine. I checked the ticket again, afraid I might have missed something. The kitchen smelled faintly of pine wood and yesterday's baked pie. Sunlight glanced off the old clock on the wall, its glass face streaked with time. Quietly, I whispered to myself, maybe this time it'll feel like home again. For years, I believed I still belonged to them, that even if distance stretched wide, family had its way of finding the road back. People here like to say, family finds its way home, and I held on to that belief like the small silver key I kept in my coat pocket, a symbol of a home that was never truly locked. As I tied the suitcase shut, a soft breeze drifted through the window. The sound of passing cars blended with the hum of the old ceiling fan. I smiled. picturing the reunion at the dock. Grace running into my arms, Ben showing off his captain's hat, and Emily, ever practical, reminding me to pack sunscreen. I could almost hear their laughter. Then my phone buzzed. A new message appeared, glowing in the morning light. "Mom, Emily wants this trip to be family only. We'll call you later, okay?" I froze. The warmth from the teacup brushed my wrist, yet a chill spread through my body. I read the words again, as if a second look might change their meaning. Family only. The words hovered, not quite falling, but heavy enough to make it hard to breathe. I didn't reply. I just stared at the half-packed suitcase. Everything inside it suddenly felt unnecessary. Outside the window, the sunlight stretched across the yard, peaceful in a way that felt cruel. I set the phone down beside the cup of tea that had already begun to cool, and left it there. I walked to the window, my hand still carrying the warmth of the cup I'd just put down. Through the glass, the road leading to the highway shimmered in the light. Ryan's silver SUV moved slowly, then turned out of the neighborhood. For a brief second, I saw Emily leaning over to fasten the kids' seat belts. No one looked toward the house. No wave, no glance back. The sound of tires faded into the wind. I stood there, fingertips resting on the window frame, feeling as though I were watching a piece of my old life drive away. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a calm voice said, "That's it, Nora. It's over." I didn't cry. I just felt an immense emptiness seep into the kitchen, the way seawater finds its way through a crack. On the table, the mint tea had gone cold, a faint trail of steam sliding down the side of the cup. I lifted it, took a sip. It tasted more bitter than ever. Not because the tea had cooled, but because for the first time, I realized I'd been drinking the wrong kind of hope for years. Noon light streamed across the table, carving a bright line through the cracked wood. Dust floated in the air, spinning lazily as if time itself were trying to turn back. I looked around. The family photo on the wall hung slightly askew. Ben's little shoes lay crooked by the door, and the turquoise scarf I'd folded neatly in the suitcase was still there, untouched. The whole house looked like a place quietly abandoned in the middle of an evacuation. The clock struck 12. I pulled out a chair and sat down, hearing the dry scrape of wood against the floor. Everything was in its place, except me. The kitchen, once the heart of the home, now felt like an airport waiting room, where everyone else was already on their way somewhere, and I was the only one left behind. I thought of Ethan, my husband, and what he told me one quiet afternoon years ago. "One day, Nora, you'll realize peace isn't something they give you. You make it yourself." Back then I just laughed, not really understanding. But now, sitting in this silence, I could feel every word of it. Maybe peace doesn't come from being invited along. Maybe it begins the moment you dare to stay, even when you're alone. I looked at the cup again. The surface of the tea was still, reflecting the ceiling above like a small mirror of a forgotten world. I pushed it gently aside and opened the window. A breeze drifted in from the lake, carrying the scent of lavender from the garden. That smell was the same as ever, only I was different. I stood there for a long time, listening to the wind move through the trees. No cars, no laughter, just the rhythm of my heartbeat, keeping time with the ticking clock. And in that moment, everything became clear enough to admit. I understood. I was no longer part of that family. No anger, no blame, just a quiet stillness spreading through my chest, like finally setting down a suitcase I'd carried for far too long. I closed the door and walked slowly back to the table. Outside, sunlight flooded the path. Inside, my shadow stretched long across the wooden floor. And for the first time in years, I didn't try to make myself smaller. Afternoon settled slowly over Willow Creek. The wind from the far fields carrying the scent of dry grass and dust. I drove along the dirt road leading to the old Thompson farm, the place that once echoed with laughter, the bark of dogs, and the soft thud of the wooden door every time Ryan ran outside to play. Now, there was only the sound of the wind. When I stepped inside, the house that used to be a home, silence greeted me first. The floorboards creaked under my feet, weary from years of waiting. Every room was coated in a thin film of dust, like memories left too long untouched. The last light of day slanted through the doorway, drawing a line across the floor, half in the past, half in the present. The kitchen still carried a faint trace of mint. I opened the cupboard. The porcelain cups sat exactly where they always had, but everything felt stripped of warmth. The clock on the wall was frozen at 3:17, perhaps the moment someone took the battery out, or maybe the moment the house itself decided to stop keeping time for those who'd left. I walked through the living room. On the wooden wall hung a new row of picture frames, none of them with my face. I stopped. In the first photo, Ryan and Emily smiled beside a Christmas tree, the kids between them, eyes bright. Next to it was a family trip to the Grand Canyon, sunlight blazing red across the glass. When I leaned closer, my own reflection blurred, distorted, as if pushed out of the frame. A slow, cold feeling crept up my neck. I brushed the edge of the frame. Dust clung to my fingertips, quiet proof of years erased. In the corner, an old coat hook still held Ethan's brown wool cap. I remembered what he once told me. A house remembers, even when people don't. I stepped into Ryan's study. The air smelled of old paper and printer ink, mixed with the chill from a window left slightly open. Light streamed across the desk, clean, organized, cold. Among the neat stacks of documents stood an old metal file cabinet, its paint chipped, its lock rusted. I hesitated for a moment, then pulled open the second drawer. Inside were neatly clipped folders, labeled in black pen. Mortgage renewal, insurance, property transfer. I skimmed through them until one bold line stopped me cold. Property owner, Nora Thompson. I gripped the edge of the paper, feeling my heartbeat pound in my ears. Inside that drawer was the deed to the house, still in my name. A part of me wanted to smile. At least something hadn't been taken away. But another part sank heavy, because I knew what it meant. All these years the house was still mine. It was they who no longer were. I sat down, running my fingers over the word owner. The ink had faded slightly, but the truth of it was sharp, almost cruel. And then a memory surfaced. The day Ethan handed me the papers for this house. He'd said, "Nora, this place will always be yours. Promise me you'll never let anyone take it from you." Now I finally understood why he'd said it that way. Each word deliberate, heavy, like a warning. Outside, the wind picked up, blowing the window open wide. The paper on the desk lifted, spinning in the air before floating to the floor. A soft reminder swirling through the silence. I bent down, picked it up, and folded it carefully. For the first time in years, I felt something solid. The quiet weight of choice, resting in my own hands. I placed the file back on the desk, a strange ache rising in my chest. Paper doesn't lie. Only the people who sign it know how to. I flipped through a few more pages until a small note at the bottom caught my eye. Primary holder for interim ownership. I read it again, then sank into the chair. So all these years I had only been the temporary name in their plan, a convenient legal placeholder, like a label stuck on a door before the new paint dries. All those times they said, "Our home, our family land." Every word had been built on my signature, and on the naivety of a mother who believed love didn't need contracts. I looked up, letting my eyes wander around the room. Every object here had once passed through my hands, polished, arranged, chosen with care. The wooden desk, I remembered picking it out myself because it felt warmer than glass. Now, surrounded by stacks of paper, nothing felt warm anymore. A tightness grew in my chest, as if someone had just erased my name from an old book. I walked down to the living room and turned on the TV, hoping to drown the silence. The screen flickered to life with a show about farms in the South. The host's voice droned on as images flashed by, women laughing under the sun. I watched them, feeling an odd distance, as if the world outside was still moving while I was trapped in a frozen frame. The noise didn't help. The sound bounced off the walls, then dissolved into the emptiness that filled the house like air too thin to breathe. I moved to the window, pulled the curtain aside, and looked out. The sky was washed in amber, the wind rippling through the barley field like waves on an ocean. I remembered Ryan as a boy saying, "Mom, the wind looks like our sea." Now all I could see were dry waves, no salt, no laughter. I sat down on the sofa, hugging a pillow to my chest. The TV still buzzed in the background, commercials bursting with color, laughter, music, all of it too loud for a house that had forgotten how to breathe. Shadows stretched into the corners of the room. I didn't turn the lights on, maybe because light would only reveal how empty it all was. The house, once so full of warmth, now held only me, and the walls that had learned how to listen. That night I lay on the couch, a wool blanket pulled up to my chest. The wind hissed softly through the window, carrying the faint scent of wilted lavender. In the dark I could hear my heart beat, slow, steady, like the ticking of a clock that refused to lie, the only honest sound left in the house. I opened my eyes, watching the faint blue glow of the TV flicker against the ceiling. A weak, uneven breath of light. And for the first time I asked myself, if I disappeared, who would notice? The question hung there, quiet, but heavy enough to make the whole room tremble in its silence. No answer came. Only the TV changed scenes, a young couple embracing under the sunset, music swelling, tender and false, like a happiness on loan. I reached for the remote and turned the TV off. Darkness fell, but I wasn't afraid. In that quiet, I realized something more haunting than the dark itself. I had lived my whole life inside this house, and no one had truly seen me. I closed my eyes, my breathing calm again. Outside, the wind swept across the porch, and the faint hum of insects began to rise. Maybe tomorrow I'll pack a few things. Not to leave just yet, but to remind myself that I still have the right to go whenever I choose. Morning in Savannah was veiled in a thin layer of mist, like the breath of someone just waking up. I drove along the lakeside road, Ethan's old car still running smoothly, letting out only a soft whine whenever I turned a corner. On the passenger seat sat a single folder, the only thing I'd brought with me from the ranch. A small brass sign appeared beyond the trees, Henry Cole and Associates, attorney at law. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, unmoving. It had been more than 10 years since I'd last seen Henry, Ethan's closest friend, and the man who'd witnessed us signing the papers for the Thompson Ranch. I wasn't sure if he'd still remember me, or if I was now just another name from an old contract. When I stepped inside, the smell of old paper and black coffee wrapped around the air. Henry looked up from behind a stack of files. For a moment, his face lit up, then softened, as if a memory had just pushed its way through the dust of time. "Nora! How long has it been?" His voice was low and gravelly, the kind of voice that spoke as if it had grown used to talking to the past. I sat down, clutching the folder in my hands. "I need you to look over something for me. It's about the Thompson Ranch." He reached across the desk and took it, unfolding the papers slowly, carefully, as though they might tear if handled too hard. Sunlight from the window slanted across the desk, catching the edge of his black-rimmed glasses. I found myself watching his hands, the same hands that had once signed beside Ethan's when we received the keys to the ranch, back when everything still felt whole. He read for a long time. Now and then he nodded slightly or furrowed his brow, then turned to the next page. The only sounds were the soft rustle of paper, the steady tick of the clock, and the quiet drum of my heartbeat, trying, somehow, to keep pace with the law written on those pages. At last, Henry set the file down. He removed his glasses and looked straight at me. His voice was low, but every word landed with weight. "Nora, you're still the legal owner of the ranch." I blinked, unsure I'd heard him right. "You mean—" He nodded, sliding one of the papers toward me, the line bold and unmistakable. "Primary owner, Nora E. Thompson. They may live there, manage the finances, make improvements, but legally they've never owned it. Ethan left these documents with me. He said that if the day ever came when you needed them, I was to return them to you." The room went quiet, so still I could hear the faint hum of traffic from the street outside. A beam of golden sunlight fell across the desk, warm and almost painful. I lowered my gaze and touched the edge of the paper. It felt thin, light, and yet, in that instant, impossibly heavy. For the first time I realized what it meant to hold something that was truly mine. For the first time the choice, the power, rested in my hands. I thought about all those years I'd lived in that house like an unpaid tenant, afraid to inconvenience anyone, afraid to lose my place, afraid my children might be angry if I asked for more. And now, everything had turned. It wasn't that they had given me anything. It was that I had been the one keeping something safe for them all along. Henry stood and poured more coffee. His voice softened, careful, as if not to break the fragile quiet between us. "Ethan once told me," he said, "that your kindness was what he loved most about you, and also what worried him the most. He was afraid that one day it would make you forget who you are." I looked down at the cup of black coffee before me. The bitter scent rose and mingled with the smell of old paper. Something inside me cracked, not from pain, but from the quiet shock of awakening. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Light slipped through the curtains, shifting from gold to white. Henry's voice cut through gently. "What will you do with this truth, Nora?" I didn't answer right away. I just smiled, faintly, as though a small door inside my heart had opened, letting the first light in. Henry turned toward an old cabinet behind him and pulled out a thick envelope, sealed with darkened wax. He set it on the desk, running a finger slowly along the edge, as if tracing the outline of an old memory. "Ethan asked me to keep this," he said quietly. "A duplicate of the contract, to protect you." His tone was even, low, unadorned. I looked at the cracked seal, at the faint handwriting across the front. "In case she needs it." Henry went on. "He said you trust too easily, and sometimes the best people are the ones who get hurt the most. Ethan wanted this to be proof, not of a house, but of the faith he had in you. If anyone ever made you doubt your own worth, this would remind you who you are." I sat there, unmoving, eyes fixed on the words as if they could speak for a lifetime. More than 20 years after his death, Ethan had found a way to protect me still, quietly, gently, faithfully. A breeze slipped through the open window, lifting the curtain. Light flickered across the desk, and I realized my hands were trembling. Henry slid the cup of coffee closer to me. "He believed you'd know when the time was right to use it." I took it, feeling the warmth spread through my palms. In my mind, I saw Ethan's face, that familiar smile, half stern, half kind. "Don't let your kindness make you small, Nora." Back then, I had heard it as simple advice. Now it returned like a revelation. Tears fell, not from sorrow, but from being seen. Not for the vague affection others once offered me, but for the deep, unshakable truth that I had once mattered to someone. That someone had believed in my worth long before I ever dared to. Henry didn't say another word. He just sat quietly while I wiped my tears with the thin tissue from the box on his desk. The clock ticked steadily in the background, each beat slow and deliberate, as if the world itself was giving me permission to begin again. I folded the documents carefully and slipped them into my bag. When I stood, Henry spoke softly. "Nora, you don't owe anyone anything. Not your children, not your past. Just live for the rest of your own life." I nodded. As I stepped outside, sunlight poured over the sidewalk, so bright I had to squint. The wind rolled in from the lake, carrying the mingled scent of salt and pine, warm, familiar, almost like Ethan was somewhere nearby, smiling. By late afternoon, I was back at the small apartment I'd been renting. On the table sat an old brown leather journal, one I'd carried for years but rarely opened. I poured myself a cup of mint tea. The scent drifted gently through the room, soft but unmistakable, like a familiar greeting. I sat down, opened to a blank page, and wrote the first line I'd written in years. "Tomorrow, I will take back my life." Just 6 words, and still my hands trembled. The ink sank slowly into the paper, the letters dark and deep, as if carved instead of written. I stared at them for a long moment, then quietly closed the journal. No tears, no drama, only a stillness, calm and solid, like the surface of a lake after the wind has passed. That night, I sat by the open window, listening to the rustle of leaves and the faint trace of mint lingering in the air. And for the first time in many years, I didn't feel like someone left behind, but someone finally walking toward the light. That morning, the clouds hung low and heavy, like a blanket that hadn't yet been shaken out. The road back to the Thompson Ranch was unnervingly quiet, the tires crunching softly over gravel. I hadn't called ahead. I already knew they were gone. Ryan had mentioned that they'd be spending the weekend at one of Emily's friends' houses. The old wooden gate groaned as I pushed it open. The air inside the house was cold, familiar, carrying the faint scent of laundry soap. I stood for a moment on the threshold, running my fingers along a small scratch on the doorframe, the spot where Ryan had once marked Grace's height with a pocket knife. The last mark stopped at 8 years old. She'd be nearly 10 now. I stepped into the hallway. Everything was spotless, too spotless, as if the house were being kept for display, not for living. In the living room, the photos I'd seen before had been reframed and hung higher up, as though to stay out of reach of anyone no longer mentioned. I went straight upstairs, into Ryan's office. The room smelled faintly of paper, printer ink, and the woody cologne he always wore. The desk gleamed, polished, deliberate, holding only a laptop, a fountain pen, and a few neatly stacked folders in a metal tray. I looked around, then slowly sat down. A strange feeling rose inside me. Sitting in my own son's office, I felt like an intruder. But Henry had been right. Truth doesn't arrive politely. You have to open the door yourself. I pulled open the right-hand drawer. Inside lay a single black folder, labeled clearly, "Proposal for Transfer of Ownership, Thompson Ranch." I opened it. The first page listed the applicant's name, Ryan Thompson. The next page detailed the property value and bore the signature of a real estate agency in Portland. At the bottom, a small note in legal print caught my eye. Pending upon owner's death or full release of estate. Effective only after the owner's death. I read it again, Slowly, word by word, they planned to sell when I was gone, as if it had all been arranged, as if I were nothing more than a pending signature in a document, waiting for time to expire. A chill moved up my spine. I glanced around the room. Ryan's framed diplomas on the wall, the photo of the family at Crater Lake, Emily's shoes neatly placed by the window. Everything looked so calm, so proper, and yet beneath that perfect order was something sharp and cold, like a blade hidden under glass. I pressed my palms against the desk, hearing the pulse pounding in my ears. So that's what it was all about, I whispered. It wasn't my imagination. It wasn't age turning me paranoid. They really had been planning a world without me in it. Sunlight filtered weakly through the curtains, cutting a pale line across the desk. Beside the folder lay a small sheet of notepaper, Ryan's handwriting, quick and uneven. For stability, Emily says it's better this way. I read it over and over, trying to imagine what stability meant to them. Money, security, or the peace that comes from not having to feel guilty anymore. I sat there a long while, staring at the papers as if they might change if I gave them enough time. But they didn't. The words stayed the same, cold, precise, and merciless. A small sparrow landed on the windowsill, chirped once, and flew away. I smiled faintly, not with joy, but just to remind myself that I still knew how. The wind turned a page, revealing Ryan's electronic signature at the end. I closed the folder. My hands were trembling, but inside, something had gone very still, like the surface of a lake once the waves have finally stopped. I sat still in that room, the papers spread across the desk, the last pale light of day slanting through the window. The wind slipped in, lifting the edge of a folder, its fluttering sound thin and fragile, like fate letting out a quiet, bitter laugh. I exhaled softly, a faint smile crossing my lips. Not bitter, not wounded, but the kind of smile that comes when you finally see what you'd only half suspected all along. Maybe they've forgotten I'm still alive. I said it under my breath, just loud enough to hear my own voice hanging in the cool air. It sounded unfamiliar, calm, steady, almost ruthlessly clear. I thought of Ryan as a child, how he used to cry every time he fell, and how I would tell him, "You're okay, it's just a scrape, get up." Maybe now it was my turn to hear those words, from the strongest part of myself. I walked down to the kitchen. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. The old mint teacup sat on the counter, a fine layer of dust around its rim. I turned on the tap, rinsed it clean, poured boiling water, and dropped in a few dried leaves. The steam rose, carrying that gentle, familiar scent. I set the cup on the wooden table beside the folder I'd brought down. Through the thin veil of vapor, I saw my reflection, composed, quiet. No tears, no trembling, only. No trembling, only the full, unbroken silence of someone who stopped begging to be understood. I sat and looked out the window toward the old garden. The light was fading. Lavender leaves swayed in the wind, catching the last orange glow of the day. In the kitchen, the clock ticked steadily. That same rhythm I'd once thought lonely, now sounding like my own heartbeat. Outside, birds were flying home. I watched them for a long while, then smiled to myself. Funny, I thought. Even birds know when it's time to go. I took a sip of tea. It was just hot enough to sting my tongue, sharp, alive, real. It felt like something inside me had woken after a long winter sleep. I looked at the folder, one signature, and everything could be gone. But that same paper reminded me, for years, I'd given away things no one had even asked for. Not anymore. No one gets to rewrite my life, but me. Outside, the wind picked up. I reached out and closed the window, but left the curtains open. I wanted to see the sky until it turned completely dark, a quiet farewell to the weaker version of myself. The decision came wordlessly. No vows, no confrontation, just a small nod to my own reflection. I wouldn't fight. I wouldn't plead. I would leave, but this time by choice, not because I was pushed. I tidied the table, slipped the documents into my bag. The tea had cooled. Its surface mirrored the soft yellow light of the kitchen lamp. When I touched the rim, the coolness of it made everything clear. The only thing worth keeping wasn't the house. It was the freedom finally returning to my heart. As I stepped toward the door, the wind tugged at the curtain, brushing against the porch. I turned back once, not to say goodbye, but to remember this exact moment, the moment a woman finally understood her own worth. I closed the door. The latch clicked shut, clean, final. Outside, the sky had deepened to a dark indigo, and I found myself smiling, small, real, the smile of someone who had just woken up. The next morning, the sky was so clear it made everything sharper, as if the world had just been washed clean. Sunlight spilled across the rows of pine trees, and the breeze stirred the leaves into a soft whisper. I sat in a small cafe near the bus station, a cappuccino in my hand, though I couldn't recall ordering it. The folder lay neatly on the table before me, no longer a burden, but proof of a new beginning. I took out my phone and dialed Henry. His voice was as steady and calm as it had been the day before. "I've thought it through," I said. "I'd like you to finalize the sale." There was a pause on the other end, long enough that I wondered if the line had gone dead. Then Henry's voice came, quiet but firm. "Are you sure, Nora? That place was Ethan's gift to you." I looked out the window where sunlight glimmered on the pavement like dust made of gold. "I know," I said, "but what Ethan gave me wasn't just a house. It was the right to choose how to live." Henry said nothing. I heard the soft tapping of keys, then his even, deliberate tone again. "I'll arrange it. A young couple came by yesterday. They're looking for somewhere peaceful, just outside of town. They said the ranch had a gentle energy." I smiled. The phrase painted an image in my mind, the woman placing her hand on the wooden wall, turning to her husband and saying, "It feels warm here." "The buyers," Henry continued, "believe the place has a kind spirit." He waited, maybe expecting hesitation, maybe a flicker of doubt. But I only answered, my voice calm, so calm it almost surprised me. "It used to." It wasn't bitterness, it wasn't regret, just truth, simple, whole. Used to. Because when love is traded for ownership, a house becomes just walls, and warmth becomes memory. I ended the call and sat quietly, watching the sky. A breeze passed through, carrying the scent of lavender from the hanging basket by the door. I took a sip of my coffee, the bitterness laced with sweetness, like the last days of a fading season. In my mind, I saw Ethan again, sleeves rolled up, a saw in his hand, laughing as sunlight poured through the frame of a new window. He used to say, "A house keeps memories, Nora. It's not meant to keep people." Now I understood. The only thing worth holding on to was the part of the memory that still let me feel light as I walked away. I left the cafe and drove toward Henry's office. He was waiting, the file already open on his desk. When I signed, the pen moved smoothly across the page. No shaking, no hesitation. Each stroke of ink echoed like a quiet drumbeat of freedom. When it was done, Henry looked up at me, his eyes a mix of concern and respect. "I know this isn't easy, Nora." I smiled. "It's easier than you think," I said. "It just took me years to be ready." Henry nodded softly. The couple would like to see the house this weekend, he said. I'll take them there, if you'd like to be present. I shook my head. That won't be necessary. I think the house deserves to meet its new owners without any old ghosts watching. He smiled faintly, perhaps understanding me better than anyone ever had. We shook hands, and I walked out, leaving behind the gentle click of the glass door closing. Clean, quiet, and final. On the drive back, I turned on the radio. A piano melody floated through the speakers, unhurried and soft, drifting like clouds. In the rearview mirror, the pine trees slid away behind me, smaller with each passing second, until they disappeared altogether. And in that strange lightness, I realized I hadn't lost a home. I had simply opened another door, one meant for myself. That afternoon, sunlight stretched long across the dirt path leading to the ranch one last time. The house stood still in its silence, as though it knew it was about to begin again, under new hands. When I opened the door, the air met me with the faint smell of old wood and dried mint, memories coming to say goodbye. I walked through each room. Every space had its own sound, the groan of a hinge, the soft sigh of the floorboards, the offbeat tick of a tired clock. My hand brushed the dining table, where laughter once lived, then paused at the window, gazing out over the lavender garden swaying in the wind. It was all still beautiful, only it no longer belonged to me. And the strange thing was, I didn't feel sorry. I sat down at the table, pulled a sheet of paper from my bag, and placed it before me. The fountain pen Henry had given me still carried ink. I drew a breath, pressed the nib to the page, and began to write. The house you call yours has been sold. I need space to find myself again. My handwriting trembled slightly, but the lines held. No reproach, no explanations, just truth. Below it, I added one more line, the instinct of a mother still choosing gentleness even in goodbye. Don't worry for me. When your heart is at peace, come visit the lavender garden. It will still be in bloom. I folded the note and placed it in the center of the table. Then, from my coat pocket, I took out the small silver key, the one I'd carried all these years, more from habit than need. I turned it in my palm. The light caught on the tiny scratches etched by time, each one a story of how I'd held on through faith alone. Then I laid it down beside the letter, next to the teacup I'd poured that morning. The water inside had cooled, reflecting a blurred version of me, but this time the eyes in that reflection were dry. I smiled faintly, hearing the clock strike 4. Departure time. I picked up my bag and walked to the door. Each step was slow, but sure. At the threshold, I turned once more. Sunlight streamed through the open doorway, falling on the table where the letter and the key rested. 2 small souls that would remain behind. I didn't close my eyes or whisper a prayer. I simply said, softly, thank you for keeping me, for as long as you did. The door closed with a sound that was neither sad nor loud, just certain. It spread through the house like a long exhale, like the sigh of something finally released. At that moment, I heard the wind move through the lavender garden, a whisper of farewell. It slipped through the doorframe, brushing against my hair, carrying the scent I knew so well. I laughed quietly, the sound warm and free, half goodbye, half blessing. Maybe the house understood. Maybe Ethan did too, that I wasn't leaving. I was continuing. I stepped down the porch without looking back. The car waited by the road, the new keys cold in my pocket. When the engine started, I caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror, rows of lavender still shimmering in the late afternoon sun. I didn't know where I was headed. I only knew that, for the first time in years, I was truly going. Not to escape, but to finally return to myself. That night, rain fell softly over Savannah. The droplets tapped gently against the tin awning of the small apartment I had just rented, a sound both strange and familiar, like a memory returning in disguise. I sat by the window, a cup of mint tea steaming beside me, its scent mellow after a long day. Outside, the streetlights smeared golden streaks across the wet pavement. Everything felt so calm, It almost didn't seem real. The phone on the table buzzed again and again. Ryan's name lit up on the screen. I stared at it for a long time before answering. His voice came through, trembling, rushed, breaking through the rain. "Mom, why did you do that?" I could hear his breathing, uneven and ragged. A car door slammed somewhere in the background. He must have pulled over to call. I pictured his face, flushed, eyes wet, jaw clenched tight. I knew that look. When Ryan was angry, it always began with fear. Leaning back in my chair, I watched the steam fog the glass. "Ryan," I said slowly, my voice low, even. "I didn't take anything from you. I just took back what was mine." On the other end, silence. The rain grew heavier, wind humming softly through the drain pipes. I could no longer hear him breathing. "You know," I began, then paused, realizing I was about to explain myself, and maybe I didn't need to anymore. "I didn't want you to carry that weight, Ryan. The house was never meant to be a chain. It's a place to return to, not a place to get stuck." I heard him swallow, trying to hold something back. Then came the quiet, deep, unbroken. I waited, but only emptiness answered. In my mind, a memory surfaced. Ryan at 7, standing in the field with a torn kite, eyes wide with fear that I'd be upset. I'd knelt beside him, patched it up, and said, "Don't be scared, I'm right here." 30 years later, we were still standing on opposite ends of that sentence. Only this time, I stayed still. "Ryan," I said softly, "sometimes holding on to something that no longer belongs to you is just another way of hurting yourself." No reply. Only rain hitting the window. And then, one short, heavy breath. Then, the line went dead. The phone screen dimmed, reflecting my face in the dark glass. I set it down. My fingers were trembling, not from anger but from the ache of a heart still echoing with unsaid words. Outside, the rain kept falling. Each drop struck the window and burst apart, disappearing before it could slide down. I stared at the empty street. Headlights passing like fleeting thoughts, here, then gone. In the stillness of that small room, the ticking clock kept its rhythm, each second peeling away another thin layer of the past. I poured more hot water into my cup. Steam rose again, softening the reflection in the window until even my own face blurred into mist. And there, in that hazy quiet, I finally understood. Sometimes love isn't about holding on, but about loosening your grip enough for both hearts to breathe again. The rain kept falling, and I sat there, silent but lighter than I'd been in years. The phone lay silent on the table, its screen dimming slowly, as if an invisible door had just closed between mother and son. I sat there a while longer, listening to the steady rhythm of rain, each drop hitting the tin roof like the slow heartbeat that follows pain. I knew I had just cut the final thread, the fragile one that tied me to the house, to the son I once believed would understand me best. And yet, strangely, I didn't feel empty. Instead, I felt myself breathing, truly breathing. For the first time in years, every inhale no longer carried the weight of memory, and every exhale no longer tasted like guilt. Maybe to find freedom, we sometimes have to surrender even the things we love most. I stood and opened the window. The damp air from the night rain rushed in, cool, sharp, new. I looked up at the sky, watching the streaks of rain cut diagonally through the glow of the streetlights. And I whispered to myself, no tremor left in my voice, "It's okay, Nora. It's time." I folded a few clothes into a small suitcase, added my journal and an old photo of Ethan. The little apartment felt suddenly bare. as if it were already waiting for someone else to move in. I left the half-empty cup of tea on the table, the steam fading to nothing, and carried my bag downstairs. In the hallway, the smell of coffee drifted from the next apartment, mixing with the scent of rain on the bricks. That unmistakable Savannah smell, salt and sweetness twined together. The night bus station was only a few blocks away. I wheeled my suitcase slowly through the drizzle, raindrops pattering softly against my coat. People waiting for the bus glanced at me, maybe thinking I was a traveler who'd missed her earlier ride. No one knew I was leaving behind an entire life. The night bus out of Savannah looked worn but clean. I climbed aboard and took a seat by the window. The interior lights glowed a soft amber. The engine hummed low and steady. The driver glanced back at me. "Savannah, ma'am?" I nodded. "Yes, one way." The door closed, the latch clicking softly. A quiet period at the end of a long sentence. I leaned my head against the glass, watching raindrops trace slow paths down the window. Outside, the outlines of buildings, lampposts, and shop signs slid backward, fading into blur. The house fell away behind me, like a chapter finally turned. I didn't look back. I kept my eyes forward, through the streaked glass where distant lights blended into the dark. All the memories, the kitchen, the smell of baked pies, the echo of children's laughter, played in reverse, drifting away like a film rewinding to silence. There was a small ache as they passed through me, but it no longer made me flinch. I thought of Ethan, of something he'd once said, "When the wind changes, let it carry you." Now I finally understood. The wind had shifted, and I was no longer afraid of being carried away. The bus climbed a small hill, then picked up speed. The city behind me softened into mist, leaving only the sound of tires slicing through wet asphalt. I closed my eyes, and within the steady rhythm of the rain I heard something new. A pulse unfamiliar yet warm, the rhythm of someone leaving, not to escape, but to begin again. The first morning in Savannah opened with a kind of light so pure I could almost hear the sun. The city lay still under a veil of mist, its white rooftops kissed with salt. I had rented a small apartment at the end of a quiet street near the ocean. Its window faced a stretch of white sand that seemed to reach the horizon. The place had only 2 rooms, low ceilings and wooden floors that creaked softly with every step. But I liked that sound. It reminded me that I was still here, still moving, still real. At night, the breeze drifted through the curtains, carrying the scent of the sea, sharp, clean, and alive. I set my small suitcase by the bed and hung up the turquoise scarf Grace once said made me look like the ocean. Now it had returned to the place it truly belonged. The next morning, before the city woke, I stepped out onto the balcony. The wind from the ocean met me, cool and damp, laced with the rhythm of distant waves and the cry of gulls greeting the dawn. I brewed a cup of mint tea. Its aroma filled the air, mingling with the briny breeze. The steam rose and vanished into the wind, delicate, fleeting, like a soft greeting from a new life. Leaning on the railing, I watched small fishing boats pull away from the docks. The sea reflected a pale rose hue, and the morning light slid across my hands, illuminating each wrinkle like tiny roads leading back through the years. I breathed deeply, letting the mingled scent of mint and salt settle inside me. There was something achingly real in that moment, a silence that no longer frightened me, but felt like space being cleared for a beginning. By noon, I wandered down to the market near the harbor to buy a few essentials. Vendors called to one another in that long, warm, southern drawl. A slender woman with silver hair was arranging pots of chrysanthemums along the curb when she looked up sharply. "Wait, Nora Thompson, is that you?" It took me a few seconds to recognize her. Mrs. Jenkins, my old neighbor from Willow Creek, surely past 70 now. I remembered her laugh, rough and low like sandpaper against wood. She set down her basket of flowers and came over to hug me. "Oh, honey, I thought you'd moved somewhere far away. Look at you. You're glowing." I smiled, and this time it was a real smile. Effortless, unforced. Maybe it's because I've stopped having to explain everything. She laughed, eyes crinkling under the soft sunlight. I like that. Then she pointed toward the end of the street. "I teach painting classes for seniors at the community center by the beach. You should come by. Nobody asks your age there, only what colors you love." I followed her gaze. At the far end of the road hung a small sign swaying in the breeze. Savannah Community Arts Center. White walls, glass doors, sunlight pouring through. Inside, a group of older folk sat around long tables, one man laughing, brush in hand, while a silver-haired woman mixed paint with the same grace as if she were pouring tea. Mrs. Jenkins turned back to me, her voice playful but kind. "We paint the things that refuse to fade," she said with a wink. "Maybe you should try." I nodded, feeling an unexpected warmth spread through my chest. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was time to learn how to mix the colors that life had once washed away. That afternoon, I stopped by the art center Mrs. Jenkins had told me about. The room was drenched in sunlight, filled with the scent of oil paint and paper. Familiar, comforting, alive. A circle of older men and women sat around the room, each of them lost in their own story on a blank sheet of paper. Mrs. Jenkins stood in the middle, wearing a paint-splattered apron. When she saw me step in, she smiled, her voice teasing but tender. "You need a new color for your life, Nora." I laughed, not at her words but at the way she said them. Light, yet it landed deep. I looked around the room. The walls lined with student paintings, the sea, a vase of flowers, a dog, and a few messy strokes of nothing but blue. I walked slowly, as if stepping through an unfamiliar but oddly welcoming memory. Then I stopped before a painting of the ocean. The blue wasn't perfect, too dark in some places, too washed out in others, bleeding beyond its edges as if it were breathing. I stared at it for a long while, then whispered, "Maybe it's the color of the sea." Mrs. Jenkins came to stand beside me, tilting her head, her eyes narrowing in thought. "That's a brave color," she said. "It looks calm, but it's always moving underneath." I smiled, just like me. We both laughed softly, our laughter blending with the rhythmic brushstrokes in the room. Outside, the ocean breeze drifted through the open window, stirring the papers on the tables. The air carried the mingled scents of salt, paint, and time. An oddly tender fragrance, not exactly pleasant but unmistakably real. I took a seat at an empty table in the corner, where a tray of watercolors and brushes waited. Mrs. Jenkins placed a fresh sheet of paper in front of me, her paint-stained fingers brushing lightly along its edge. "Don't think too much," she said. "Just start." I lifted the brush. The first touch of bristles against paper made my hand tremble slightly. A drop of color fell, deep blue, spreading softly, like a breath released. I painted the horizon, then the sea. My hand was clumsy, but my heart was light. Each stroke felt like an exhale, each patch of color a memory rinsed clean. I signed up for the class, Not to become good, but to see myself again through the shades I'd never learned to name. From behind me, Mrs. Jenkins nodded. "That's it," she said quietly. "You're not painting the scene, Nora. You're painting the space you finally own." I looked at the canvas, the soft blues and whites blending into one another, still formless but already glowing with light. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of the blank spaces. They no longer looked empty. They looked like invitations, waiting to be filled with my own breath. By the time class ended, the sky had turned to gold. I stood outside the art center, watching the sun sink behind the ocean. The glass doors reflected my silhouette, small but clear. And I smiled. Maybe this was the first time I'd truly seen myself. A breeze swept by, carrying the faint scent of mint from the tea bag in my tote. I poured a sip into the paper cup, warm and clean on my tongue. Somewhere in the distance, seagulls called across the waves, reminding me that tomorrow would begin again in light. And this time, I wouldn't turn away from it. One late afternoon in May, Savannah was drenched in a dim golden haze, the kind that comes before a storm. I was making tea when the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, a Portland area code. I answered, and within a few sentences I felt my heart sink. "Mrs. Nora Thompson?" The man's voice on the other end was cold and metallic. "I'm the attorney representing Mr. Ryan Thompson. My client wishes to discuss the inheritance rights of the Thompson Ranch, regarding the property you sold without the family's consent." I stood still, the teacup in my hand, steam rising but no longer warm to the touch. Then he said, almost as an afterthought, "Betrayal of the family. That's what they're calling it." A faint smile crossed my lips, small, quiet, not bitter. Something inside me had just fallen, gently, like a stone settling at the bottom of a calm lake. Ryan had hired a lawyer. My own son was accusing me of betraying the family. Family. I repeated the word silently, as if it belonged to some old language I once spoke but had forgotten how to use. After I hung up, I didn't move. On the table, the mint tea fogged faintly, a thin ribbon of smoke curling upward, like a spirit reluctant to leave. Outside, the sky turned the color of ash, and the wind began to lift the white sand into swirling gusts. I called Henry. He answered after 2 rings, his voice calm, steady, reassuring, the same as always. "I know, Nora," he said. "Don't worry. Everything is still within the law." The next afternoon, I went to his office. Henry sat behind his desk, sleeves rolled up, a stack of papers open before him. He tapped his pen lightly against the folder, his gaze calm in a way that settled my nerves. "I've reviewed their letter," he said, sliding an envelope toward me. "They're trying to argue that you acted unilaterally, but they have no legitimate claim to ownership, and," he reached into a drawer and pulled out another file. "This is a copy of Ethan's will, along with the notarized transfer documents. Everything was legally settled years ago. No one has the right to touch what's yours." He looked up, his tone sharper now. "Henry's response is simple," he said. "Documents. Clear, legal, final. And sometimes, silence is the strongest answer." I looked at the stack of papers before me. It wasn't just legal proof. It was the quiet evidence that I no longer had to bow my head in my own life. Yet, strangely, I didn't feel triumphant. There was no sense of victory, only stillness, a kind of solemn peace. Henry poured me a cup of coffee and set it down gently, as if afraid to disturb the silence that had settled between us. "You don't need to respond, Nora," he said softly. "The truth will speak for itself." I nodded. "I know." The old clock on the wall struck 3, 3 steady chimes echoing through the quiet room. I looked at Henry, a man just a few years older than me, silver hair slightly tousled, eyes kind in a way the world rarely remembers how to be. He didn't need to say anything more. We both understood. Sometimes loss isn't what's taken from you. It's what finally reveals who's truly still standing by your side. I thanked Henry and stepped out of his office. Outside, the sky had opened after the rain, clouds parting in uneven patches, revealing a faint band of blue. I drew in a deep breath, tasting the salt in the air, the trace of mint from the tea bag in my purse blending with it. I wasn't angry. I just felt sorry for my son, for how little he understood the word dignity. Dignity isn't about holding on to everything through power. It's knowing when to let go before you hurt someone you love. Maybe it would take Ryan years to learn that. It had taken me half a lifetime. On my way home, I stopped in front of the small art shop on the corner. Behind the window hung the painting I'd made in class, the ocean, its colors uneven, imperfect, but true. I looked at it, and in the reflection on the glass, I saw a woman I barely recognized, calm, eyes bright, smiling without fear of judgment. The wind from the sea swept up the street, cool and damp against my skin. I walked slowly, carrying within me that strange mix of sadness and lightness, as if the world, at last, had quietly admitted that I was still here, alive, and strong enough to stop proving it. By late afternoon, I reached Mrs. Jenkins's house. It sat on the corner behind a white fence, a lavender bush blooming violet by the gate. She was watering her garden, wearing a cotton dress speckled with paint. She looked like part of the landscape itself. When she saw me, she smiled, her eyes carrying that warmth only those who've known sorrow can hold. "Well," she said, "you look like someone who's been through a storm and survived." I smiled and sat on the wooden chair beneath her porch. Maybe I just walked out of a storm I'd let last far too long. She handed me a cup of tea. Steam rose, the scent of mint mingling with the damp smell of soil after rain. I told her about Ryan, about the lawyer, the letters, the papers. Not bitterly, not as complaint, just as someone might recount a dream they've finally woken from. She listened without interrupting, her hand stroking the cat curled in her lap. When I finished, she exhaled softly, her voice low and steady. "Sometimes, loss is the tuition for greed." I didn't answer. Her words carried no judgment, only the quiet weight of truth. She went on. "People think loss is punishment, but sometimes it's just the price we pay to learn what really matters. Your son may have to pay that price. And you, Nora, you've already paid yours. Half a lifetime of it." I looked at her, then down at the cup in my hands. The steam had faded, but the scent of mint lingered, still fragrant, even as the water cooled. It made me think of Ethan, and the quiet afternoons when he was still alive. He used to say, "Tea is like people, Nora. When it cools, only the aroma proves it was ever warm." I smiled faintly. Maybe I had already passed through the boiling point of anger and pain, and what was left was just the fragrance. Lighter, but true. Mrs. Jenkins placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "You did what you had to do," she said. "Freedom always costs something. The lucky ones are those who get to pay it, and still live to tell the story." I nodded, saying nothing. The sun was setting behind the rooftops, spilling its last pale gold across the porch floor. I stood, thanked her, and began my walk home. Street lights flickered on one by one, and every glowing window looked like an eye of the city, watching, kind, and alive. I didn't feel lonely. I just felt real, as if every step I took now left a mark on a path I had finally chosen myself. When I got home, I hung up my coat and went to the bathroom. In the mirror, I saw a face older than I remembered, but free. The lines didn't scare me anymore. They looked like proof, quiet evidence
that I'd survived what once felt impossible. I touched my cheek. The coolness of my fingertips spread through my skin, then inward, all the way to my chest. The warm light above cast a soft glow on my reflection. Tired eyes, faint shadows beneath them, but bright. Bright in the way of someone who has found the peace of herself she thought was lost forever. I turned toward the easel in the corner, the unfinished painting, Savannah at dawn. The blue of the sea was still wet, bleeding softly into the pink of the sky. I lifted my brush and added a single stroke of light along the horizon. The painting wasn't perfect, but it was alive, just like me.
Morning light flooded the art studio. The wide windows opened toward the sea, the breeze pushing the white curtains until they swelled and fell like sails in motion. On the tables, trays of watercolor shimmered under the sun. I sat in the second row, brush in hand, a blank sheet of paper before me, untouched, waiting. Our teacher that day was a middle-aged painter with kind eyes and a voice as deep and warm as wet wood. He moved slowly around the room, watching each of us work, then stopped to say in a tone that carried farther than you'd expect, "Watercolor doesn't obey anyone. Only the patient ever understand it." A few of the younger students laughed, thinking he was joking, but I understood. Watercolor, like life, slips away the harder you try to control it. I touched the brush to the page. The tip bloomed with blue, spreading softly, like breath. On the white paper, the water began to move, slow, gentle, unpredictable. I tilted the page, letting the color find its own path. The way it bled across the surface reminded me of the years behind me, the marriage, the widowhood, the children growing up and growing distant, and me, left behind, trying to hold everything together with empty hands. Now, watching the paint drift and settle, I realized I was that watercolor, no longer trying to stay in one shape, no longer resisting the flow, just letting myself spread, fade, and blend. And still, somehow, exist. The brush moved slower now. I mixed in a soft orange, then a hint of indigo. The light reflected across the thin film of water, turning it into something glimmering, half memory, half mirage. Not real, but enough to steady my heart. "Paint what you remember, not what you see," the teacher said as he passed behind me. I nodded. It was as if he'd spoken directly to the quiet place inside me. I rinsed the brush, pressed it gently against the cloth, then began to paint longer, surer lines. On the page, a pale orange sky took shape, a few dark tree silhouettes, and water catching the last glow of the sun. Under my strokes, Willow Creek at sunset began to appear, the place I had left behind, but where my soul still lingered. I added one final stroke of light across the horizon, then set the brush down. My heartbeat was slow but strong, as though each mark I'd just made wasn't paint at all, but the words I'd never dared to say. I sat there, hands stained with color, watching the painting as the afternoon sun slanted through the window. It glowed gently, not perfect, not by any artistic rule, but alive in a way that felt almost human. "That's lovely," the teacher said, pausing behind me. I turned. He gave a small nod, smiling with quiet understanding. "You found your rhythm." I didn't answer, only bowed my head slightly. But inside, I knew, for the first time in years, I could finally hear my own rhythm. When class ended, I didn't rush home. I stayed for a while, watching the sea through the open window. The sunset stretched across the water, burning bright, then softening into dusk. exactly like the painting I had just finished. And me, a woman who once believed herself emptied out, now felt her heart quietly full again. I folded the painting carefully and slipped it into my bag. The scent of paint, salt, and the faint mint from my tea mixed together into something new. The fragrance of freedom, freshly reclaimed. A month later, the Art Center hosted a small exhibition in Savannah for its older students. The room glowed with warm light. The air was thick with the smell of paint and the low hum of jazz. Through the glass windows, the coastal street shimmered with golden lamps, while inside, the walls were lined with memories reborn in color. I stood in the far corner, my painting, Willow Creek at Sunset, hanging quietly on the white wall. Under the lights, the shades of blue and orange blended together, like two fragments of memory both parting and holding on. I looked at it for a long time, feeling a sudden sting behind my eyes. Visitors walked slowly, pausing at each canvas, smiling, nodding, or simply standing still. When they stopped before mine, I heard a gray-haired woman point and ask, "This is beautiful. Whose memory is it?" I answered softly, my voice steady. "It's the memory of someone who was once forgotten." The woman looked at me, then nodded, that quiet kind of nod that only those who understand can give. No questions, no explanations, just recognition. And in that moment, warmth spread through me. Not because she admired the painting, but because for the first time I felt seen. Not as someone's mother, not as a shadow at the edge of someone else's story, but simply as myself, as Nora. An older man stepped closer, reading the card beneath the frame. Nora Thompson, Savannah Art Circle. He smiled and turned to his wife. "She paints like she's remembering something she forgave." The words hit me softly, like wind across water. Something she forgave. Yes, that's what gave the painting its life. I no longer painted from pain, but from the calm that follows it. For the first time, I was being seen as a person, not a parent, not a burden, not a name in someone else's story. Just a woman who had loved, lost, and lived. Mrs. Jenkins appeared beside me, holding a glass of red wine, her eyes glinting with pride. "Well, look at you, Nora," she said. "They're all looking at your painting." I smiled, small but genuine. "Maybe they're seeing themselves in it." She laughed, raising her glass. "To finding color after the storm." We clinked glasses, the soft chime of crystal breaking open the quiet like summer itself had cracked into light. The wine warmed me as I looked around the room, the laughter, the gentle voices, the slow steps of people walking with canes or in wheelchairs, all of them glowing like small lamps in the calm of that evening. I thought of Ryan, of Grace, of all the years I'd orbited around them, like a planet circling a sun that never turned to look back. And I realized, in the end, what I needed wasn't more love. It was simply to be seen, to exist, whole, as myself. That night, when the exhibition ended, I took my painting down. The organizer told me I should leave it. Someone wanted to buy it. I shook my head. "No, thank you. It's not for sale." He smiled, the knowing smile of someone familiar with that answer. The kind of answer that comes from those who've already paid for their art with something deeper than money. I carried the painting down to the beach. The moon was up, the waves gentle. I sat on the stone steps and placed the canvas beside me. The orange shimmer of the sea reflected the moonlight, glimmering just like in the painting. The wind rose, carrying the mingled scent of salt and fresh paint. I whispered to myself, almost like a prayer, if I could paint my heart, it would look like this. And in that quiet moment, I knew I had truly begun to live again. That morning in Savannah was impossibly clear. The wind from the sea drifted through the open window, carrying the scent of salt and a faint trace of lemon from the rain the night before. I was watering the pots of mint on my windowsill when I heard the postman call my name. A single envelope fell into my hands, cream-colored, thick paper, with handwriting so familiar that my heart hesitated mid-beat. I stood still for a few seconds. The sunlight shone through the envelope, revealing the trembling lines of ink. Mrs. Nora Thompson, Savannah, Georgia. I didn't need to open it to know who it was from. A letter from Emily. I carried it inside and set it on the wooden table beside my half-warm cup of tea. My fingers brushed the edge of the paper. I could feel the hesitation in my own pulse. How long had it been since I last held a handwritten letter from them? Perhaps since Ethan's final birthday, the last time Emily signed her name, your loving daughter-in-law. I opened it slowly. Inside was a folded page, faintly scented with her perfume, that cool, clean fragrance I once knew so well, distant and composed, just like the woman I used to call my daughter. The first line caught in my throat. Nora, we were wrong. 3 small words, heavier than accusation, heavier than silence itself. I kept reading. We've started therapy. The doctor says some wounds pass through generations. Ryan is trying to understand that. And I've realized I used control to cover my fear of being left behind. I don't know how to begin asking for forgiveness, so I'm writing this instead. The bottom corner of the paper was slightly warped, as if touched by tears before it dried. I read on, until the final line softened like her handwriting itself. Every night, Grace asks why you don't come home anymore. I told her you live by the sea now, where there's sunshine and mint tea. She says, when she's older, she'll come find you there. I set the letter down. The room filled with silence. Only the ticking of the clock and the distant sound of waves outside the window. I poured fresh hot water into the teapot. The mint leaves swirled, then settled, releasing their fragrance, light and deep. I placed the letter on the table and sat for a moment, letting the warmth from the tea rise through me. It wasn't the warmth of happiness, but of something long frozen finally beginning to thaw. I carried my cup out to the balcony. Morning light fell over the sea. The surface shimmered like glass, each wave a small mirror reflecting the sky. I sat in the wooden chair, the letter beside me, and watched the steam of the tea rise into the salty air. For the first time, I didn't see the distance between us as a fracture, but as an open space waiting to be filled with courage. I thought of Grace, her curly brown hair, her bright laugh, her small hands clutching mine while I read her stories. Grandma, why do people stay quiet when they're sad? She'd once asked. Back then, I hadn't known how to answer, but now I did. Because sometimes silence is the only way to preserve what little good remains in love. The wind brushed across the balcony, making the letter flutter gently. I placed my hand on it to keep it still. My heart trembled, not from fear this time, but from something tender, something awakening. Maybe this was what I had been waiting for all along. Not an apology to erase the past, but a sign that they were trying to understand. A seagull swept past, its shadow gliding over the cream-colored paper before vanishing into the sky. I watched it go, then lifted my cup and took a slow sip. The taste of mint spread across my tongue, fresh, clean, forgiving. And in that quiet morning light, I could almost hear the sea whisper back to me, "See? They're trying." I smiled, for the first time in months, not because of memory or sorrow, but because of hope, the quiet kind of hope that comes when you realize your heart still has room for forgiveness. I sat at the table until noon, reading the letter again. Each line seemed to breathe, trembling yet sincere. Between the pauses I could sense a change, not only in their apology, but in how they were learning to say the things they had once been afraid to say. I opened the drawer, took out a small notepad and a blue ink pen. Without thinking too long, I wrote, "Thank you for having the courage to be honest. I'm okay." 4 short lines, nothing more, nothing less, but exactly what I meant. No blame, no explanation, just acceptance. Something that once felt unreachable, now suddenly so simple. I folded the paper, slipped it into an envelope, sealed it, and wrote, "To Ryan and Emily, from Mom." Before mailing it, I called Mrs. Jenkins over for tea. She brought a tray of freshly baked butter cookies, their scent mingling with the aroma of mint tea in the bright sunlit room. I handed her the letter and asked, "What do you think? Is it enough?" She read it quickly, then smiled that gentle, knowing smile. "Forgiveness doesn't need words," she said. "It just needs peace." I looked at her and stayed quiet for a while. She was right. Forgiveness isn't an action, it's a feeling. It doesn't happen the moment you write or speak. It happens when you no longer need to win. Mrs. Jenkins poured herself a cup of tea and glanced out the window. "You know," she said softly, "most people wait for the right time to forgive, but there's no such thing. One day you just wake up and realize the anger isn't worth carrying anymore." I nodded, watching the steam rise from my cup of mint tea. It caught the light pouring through the window, clear, soft, and real. The sky reflected in the surface of the tea, and in it, my face appeared, not sad, just calm. I whispered, almost to myself, "I used to think forgiveness was a gift for someone else, but maybe it's how we save ourselves." Mrs. Jenkins smiled, her eyes narrowing kindly. "That's the only kind that works." We sat there in silence. The afternoon sunlight spread across the wooden floor like a soft golden carpet. The scent of butter cookies, mint, and lavender filled the room. A small sparrow landed on the windowsill, tilted its head toward us, then flew off, light as the afternoon itself. I stood, carried the envelope to the mailbox down the street. When I let it fall through the slot, the soft sound of paper brushing metal made me exhale, as if something inside me had finally been released. Back in the apartment, I brewed a fresh cup of tea. The water boiled, the mint leaves unfurled, and their fragrance filled the air. I carried the cup to the balcony. The breeze rippled the surface of the tea, and I sat down, breathing deeply. The reflection of the sky shimmered in the cup, blue, endless, almost close enough to touch. And I realized there was a sky like that inside me now, too. Not perfect, but wide open. I took a sip. The mint cooled my tongue, spreading gently through me. Below, the waves rolled in, steady and calm. "I'm fine," I whispered. Not to anyone, just to the wind. "I'm fine, truly." And in that moment, I knew. I was no longer living in anyone's past. I was here, in the present, peaceful and free. The rain had started at noon and lingered well into the afternoon. Savannah, under rain, took on a different kind of beauty, quiet and luminous, as if the whole city was being washed clean. Raindrops drummed against the tin roof, trickled down the gutters, slipped along the narrow eaves, and disappeared into the street below. I sat in my small apartment, a cup of mint tea in hand, listening to that familiar rhythm of the season. I didn't know a visitor was on his way. A knock sounded between the falling rain, 3 slow, deliberate taps. I rose, drew the curtain aside, and peered out. There, on the porch, stood a figure drenched through, head bowed, something clutched in a plastic sleeve. Even after all these years, I recognized that stance. Ryan. I opened the door. The wind rushed in, carrying the damp smell of earth after rain. His shirt clung to him. His hair was soaked, water dripping onto the floor in thin, uneven trails. "Mom," he said, voice hoarse, trembling slightly. I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me, but I had to come." I didn't speak. I stepped aside, letting him in. He hesitated for a heartbeat, then entered, leaving the sound of the storm behind him. The small room felt suddenly fuller, as if memory itself had walked through the door. Ryan peeled away the layer of plastic and pulled out a piece of paper, a drawing by Grace. The colors had blurred in places, washed by the rain, yet the image remained clear enough. A gray-haired woman standing by a window, bathed in warm light. Below it, in uneven letters, was written, "Grandma, you are my light." I stared at it, feeling my throat tighten. "She drew it at school," Ryan said softly. "She said every time she turns on the lamp in her room, she thinks of you. Emily says she still says goodnight to you every night." He looked up at me, eyes red-rimmed, as if sleep had been a stranger for a long time. "I know you don't need to hear excuses, Mom," he continued, voice low. "I just need you to know that I understand now." His words fell into the room like a single heavy raindrop, and in his eyes that once avoided mine, I saw something unguarded, honest. Outside, the rain thickened, drumming harder against the porch. A faint roll of thunder murmured in the distance. I said nothing. Instead, I handed him a towel. He gave a small, awkward smile, taking it, wiping at his hair and hands. Clumsy, almost boyish. And for a fleeting moment, I saw the child he once was. The little boy who'd run through the garden, fallen, dirt streaking his clothes, yet still grinning. "I'm okay, Mom." Now the man before me was no longer that boy, but in his eyes lingered something unhealed, a fragile mix of guilt and quiet relief. I poured him a cup of tea and set it before him. "Sit down, Ryan." He sat, both hands wrapped around the cup as if for steadiness. The steam rose, blurring part of his face. Neither of us spoke. We simply listened, to the rain tapping on the roof, to the world breathing outside. All the anger, the explanations, the hurt, they belonged to another time. What remained was just this, a mother and her son, sitting across from each other in a silence that felt both distant and deeply familiar. Ryan placed Grace's drawing on the table, turning it slightly toward me, as if letting it speak for him, saying what words could not. Light from the window touched the damp paper, making the colors shimmer, alive again. I looked at it for a long time, then lifted my gaze. "It's all right," I said softly. My voice was steady now. "Leave it here, Ryan. Let it stay warm." He nodded, a tired smile flickering across his lips. I knew he wasn't seeking forgiveness, only a sign that the door was still open. And perhaps that was exactly what I had been waiting to give. I sat still, watching Ryan with his head bowed, both hands wrapped tightly around his cup. The steam rose, fogging his face, softening the lines that guilt had carved there. Outside, the rain kept falling in even rhythm, each drop striking the roof like the faint knock of memory returning. Perhaps, in that silence, we were both just learning how to breathe again. I looked at him, not with anger, only with tenderness. Tenderness for all the years he had lived in fear, trying so hard to be right instead of live right. Tenderness for the ways I, too, had once planted in him the mistaken belief that love was duty, that devotion meant obedience, even when the heart resisted. He lifted his head. His eyes shimmered. I couldn't tell if it was the reflection of rain or tears. "Mom," he began, his voice breaking, I don't know when I became the kind of man I used to fear most. I don't want Emily or Grace to see me that way." I shook my head gently before he could go on. "It's all right, Ryan," I said, my voice soft, almost weightless. "Live well, not to make amends, but to love better. He was quiet, eyes glistening. Outside, the rain grew heavier, rattling the window pane as if asking to be let in. I looked at my son, this man who had once measured love by contracts, sacrifices, and control. And now he sat here, trying to relearn how to love, like a child forming his first word. I reached out and touched his hand. His skin was cold, but the pulse beneath it was steady, alive. He squeezed back, trembling slightly, then exhaled. "I used to think I hated you," he said hoarsely, "but I realize now. I only hated the part of me that wasn't brave enough to understand you." I smiled faintly. We've both been there, Ryan. I've done the same. A gust of wind swept through, rattling the door softly. The light spilling in from the porch was golden, the kind that comes just before dusk. We stood almost at the same time. I looked at him, his wet hair, his face worn by regret, and in his eyes I saw something stir back to life. I opened my arms. He stepped forward slowly, then held me tight. We stayed like that, mother and son, wrapped in the sound of rain mingling with quiet tears. The warmth of him seeped through me, and for a moment I was back in that garden years ago, when he'd fallen, and I had pulled him close, whispering comfort until his sobs faded. Only this time, I wasn't trying to stop his tears. I was simply letting him cry. The rain slanted through the window, each drop on the eaves sounding like two hearts beating in time. I closed my eyes and let the moment hold me. No words, no apologies. Just two people finally healing in each other's arms. I felt my shoulder grow damp, though I couldn't tell if it was from the rain or his tears. Perhaps both. I patted his back gently and whispered, "It's all right, honey. We're okay." He said nothing, just nodded against me. Outside, the rain softened, the sound thinning into the gentlest hush, wind moving across the porch like a sigh. We stood there for a long time, until the whole room seemed filled with the scent of mint, the quiet after rain, and the warmth of something true. A truth that didn't need a winner, only two hearts still beating. When he finally stepped back, his eyes were red, but there was a small, unguarded smile on his lips. I touched his cheek and said quietly, "Go home, Ryan. Grace needs to see that kind of light in you." He nodded, bowed his head, and left. Outside, the rain had stopped. Only the sound of droplets falling from the eaves remained. I watched him walk down the street, his shoulders lighter than when he came. When the door closed behind him, I poured myself another cup of tea. The steam rose in soft spirals, and in that gentle warmth, I could hear my own heart again. No longer aching, just beating slowly, like the heart of a mother who finally knows. Love has found its way home. December arrived in Savannah with cold winds and a golden haze that lingered over the sea. I wrapped my old wool scarf around my neck and pushed open the door to the art center, now bearing a new sign, Savannah Art for Little Hearts. It was Mrs. Jenkins's idea, and me, once the woman who painted to heal, I now taught others, especially children, to do the same. We ran a small art class together. The room was bathed in sunlight, the walls covered in bright little paintings, candy-colored houses, curled-up cats, skies full of stars. The children sat around the tables, their laughter echoing between the scent of paint and the smell of butter cookies that Mrs. Jenkins always brought. I moved between them, straightening easels, tying the little girl's ribbon, wiping a streak of blue from a boy's nose. They often asked, "Miss Nora, how do you make a painting happy?" I smiled and told them, "When your hand trembles because you feel joy, the painting will know." They giggled, thinking I was joking, but I wasn't. Happiness is quiet, but it leaves its trace. Outside the window, the sea breeze blew stronger, carrying the tang of salt into the room. In the corner, Mrs. Jenkins was making tea, carefully pouring it into 2 small cups. The scent of mint drifted through the air, familiar, steady, comforting. I smiled. When class ended and the light began to fade, I walked home. In my little apartment, I switched on the small lamp in the living room. Its glow spilled through the window, reflecting off the string of Christmas cards I had pinned to the wall. Cards from my students, from neighbors, and one envelope from a familiar address, Portland, Oregon. Before opening it, my phone lit up with an incoming video call. Grace. I answered. Her face appeared on the screen, framed by a small Christmas tree behind her, its lights twinkling softly. Emily sat beside her, her expression calm, warm. No tension, no distance left between us. "Grandma, I finished my drawing," Grace said, holding up a piece of paper, eyes bright with excitement. I laughed. On the paper was a drawing of an old woman with silver hair, sitting by a window, a cup of tea in her hand, a pot of lavender beside her. The lines were simple, clumsy, but full of love. Below it, written in colored pencil, "Grandma, I drew you with your tea. Mom says mint smells like peace." I pressed a hand to my lips. A small sob caught in my throat. Emily leaned closer to the screen, her voice soft as the light after rain. Grace insisted on drawing it herself. She said the world smells better when she thinks of you. I smiled through tears that slipped quietly down my face. I wiped them quickly before Grace could see. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," I said. "I can almost smell the mint from here." Grace giggled. "Mom says when I miss you, I can make mint tea and pretend we're drinking it together." Emily added gently, "She really does. Every night before bed, she pours herself a tiny cup and says, 'Good night, Grandma.'" I didn't speak for a while. Something warm spread through me, soft, bright, like a candle being lit inside my chest. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice trembling. "Both of you." Emily nodded, smiling. Not with guilt this time, but with peace. And just then, Ryan passed behind them, placing a hand on Grace's shoulder. He looked into the camera, gave a small, hesitant smile, and said, "Hi, Mom." I nodded. Simple, but enough. "Hi, Ryan." There was nothing else to say. Our eyes spoke what words couldn't. Remorse, gratitude, and a kind of peace I had never seen in them before. Across the screen, Grace lifted her little plastic teacup. "Cheers, Grandma!" I laughed, raising my real cup. "Cheers, my love." The screen glowed with the shimmer of Christmas lights, their reflections dancing across the faces of my family. A family that, despite the miles and years between us, was slowly finding its way back together through the smallest of gestures. Outside, rain fell softly along the Savannah shoreline. The beam from the lighthouse swept past my window, and for a fleeting moment, it felt as if even the ocean was smiling. When the call ended, the screen dimmed, leaving only my reflection against the glass. I sat there for a while, listening to the gentle hush of waves in the distance. The scent of mint still lingered in the air, light, cool, and real. I smiled. Yes, they finally understood. Not who I was, but why I had left. That my silence back then wasn't punishment, but an invitation. A pause long enough for them to hear their own hearts. Some truths can only be heard when a person has grown quiet enough to listen. And tonight, I knew Ryan, Emily, and Grace had finally heard. I rose and stepped out onto the balcony. The sea stretched wide beneath the soft gold of Christmas lights strung along the boardwalk. Each bulb glowed like a quiet note held in the air. I drew in a deep breath. The cold wind filled my chest but didn't make me shiver. It only made my heart beat louder. Inside, the small pine tree I'd bought at the market glowed warmly. Silver ornaments reflected the flicker of candlelight, glinting like droplets of memory. I looked at them and realized I wasn't waiting for an apology anymore. I no longer needed to be asked for forgiveness, I only needed them to live without pretending. Sometimes forgiveness isn't about bowing the head, it's about daring to lift it and live honestly. I once believed love had to be spoken, proven with tears, with embraces held too tight. Now I understood. Sometimes love is simply two people looking toward the same horizon, without needing to explain a thing. On the table, my cup of mint tea had gone cold. The thin film of mist on the rim faded in the soft warmth of the room. I touched the glass. Cool, but not cold. It felt real, like a life that no longer needed to strain to stay warm. I opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The wind carried the salt of the sea and the scent of gingerbread from the bakery down the street. I pulled the scarf tighter around my neck and looked up. And then, something rare happened in Savannah. Snow. Tiny flakes, thin as breath, drifted through the salty air. They landed on the sand and melted instantly, leaving glimmers like scattered pearls. I held my breath, afraid to move. It's rare in this world for snow and sea to exist together, but tonight they did. Proof that opposites can coexist, that grace can live beside grief. Beyond the window, the snow fell lightly over the golden beach, fleeting but beautiful. I watched in silence. Like the snowflakes, old memories melted the moment they touched what was true: love, light, understanding. I whispered to the night, my voice barely louder than the wind. We made it, Ethan. They finally found their way. I imagined him sitting somewhere near, smiling, a cup of mint tea in his hand. A part of me believed he'd never really left, that he'd always been here, quiet and steady as the light from the sea, never bright enough to blind, but never fading either. Inside, the clock struck 12. Christmas had arrived. I closed the door, poured hot water into my cup, and watched the steam rise, curling into the faint notes of music from the radio. Silent night, holy night. I sat down, wrapped the blanket around my shoulders. Outside, the snow kept falling, the sand still glowed, and the wind carried the scent of mint far into the night. And in that moment, I understood. Happiness isn't loud. It's the quiet gratitude of simply being here, alive, watching, and understanding. A year later, I went back to Willow Creek. The bus cut through fields washed in spring light, the air carrying the scent of wet earth and new grass. I sat by the window, a paper cup of coffee warming my hands, my heart steady, but trembling. From Savannah to here was only a few hours, yet to me, it felt like crossing an entire lifetime. Willow Creek hadn't changed much. The main road was still paved with cobblestones, the lines of poplars still bent with the wind. But something was different, softer, lighter. Perhaps it wasn't the town that had changed, but me. The taxi stopped at the old farm gate. The wooden posts I once painted had been repainted ivory white. The sign, Thompson Ranch, was gone, replaced by a small hand-carved board that read, The Morning Field, home of the Parkers. The farm now belonged to a young couple. The garden was in full bloom. I stood by the roadside looking through the fence. The lavender field had been revived, rows of soft purples swaying like ripples on water. The house was painted a gentle cream, curtains newly hung, and a pair of muddy boots rested on the porch, proof of life being lived. Somewhere inside, a woman's laughter called out to her husband as he mowed the grass. My eyes blurred, not from sadness, but from the quiet realization that what I left behind hadn't disappeared. It had simply taken a new shape. The house that once held heavy memories was breathing again, calm, humble, just as it was always meant to be. I opened my bag and pulled out a small bundle of dried lavender I'd brought from Savannah. The color had faded, but the scent was still strong. I walked to the gate, knelt, and placed the bundle gently on the step. "Thank you," I whispered, "for letting this place live again." The wind brushed through my hair, a soft, familiar touch, like a hand laid gently on my shoulder. Through the window, I saw the young woman inside pouring tea, steam curling upward as light poured through a white curtain. The sight warmed my chest, so peaceful, so real, so whole. A small dog trotted out, barked twice, then stopped, watching me with curious eyes. I crouched down and offered my hand. He sniffed, then licked my fingers, as if greeting an old friend. "Good boy," I murmured, smiling. And in that small, ordinary moment, I felt Ethan near, not as an image or a voice, but as a quiet knowing that he would be glad to see this house still breathing, still loved. I stepped back, standing alone by the wooden fence, taking in the scene like a living painting, the lavender fields, the laughter, the faint curl of steam from a cup of tea, all of it blending into a kind of peace. From my coat pocket, I took out an old photograph, the four of us standing right here years ago. Ryan was laughing, Claire and Sam ran through the grass, and Ethan had his arm around me. I traced my fingertip over each face before tucking the photo away again. It no longer felt heavy, just gentle, like a familiar song. A car passed, scattering a light trail of dust. I turned and began walking away from the old road. Each step seemed to release a little more of the past. From the distance, the church bells rang, their sound blending with the wind. Willow Creek was the same, but this time, I'd come not to hold on, but to see clearly that even when we leave, love can still take root in the wounds we once carried. By the time I left the farm, the sky had turned gold. Sunlight filtered through the trees, spilling over the dirt road that led back toward town. With every step, my heart grew lighter. Once, this road had hurt to walk. Every fence, every shadow reminding me of things unsaid. Now it was just a road, a simple, honest path leading me forward, to a place where the past no longer asked me to stop. At the bottom of the hill, a car was waiting. Ryan and Emily stood beside it, waiting for me, their smiles warm, unguarded, and real. The house sat quietly at the edge of the woods, its low wooden roof framed by a garden full of white daisies. Through the open window came the smell of stew and toasted bread, blending with the tender breath of early spring. Ryan was standing on the porch, hands in his pockets, his eyes a mix of nervousness and warmth. Emily stepped out after him, a folded tablecloth in her hands. "Mom," she said softly, as if afraid the sound might break something fragile. I nodded and smiled. No words were needed. Our eyes said enough. Emily came closer, her fingers brushing mine, trembling just slightly. "Would you stay for dinner?" she asked, voice unsteady. I looked at her, then at Ryan. The two of them stood side by side, like people trying to relearn how to speak to someone they once lost. "Of course," I said gently, "as long as there's room for me." Emily smiled, a real smile this time. She turned back toward the door, Ryan following, and I stepped across the threshold. Inside, the small room glowed in soft gold. On the table were 3 plates, 3 glasses of water, and a small vase of lavender. Grace's touch, no doubt. We sat. No one knew where to begin. The quiet wasn't heavy anymore. It was the kind that comes when people are learning how to sit beside one another without pretending their wounds aren't there. The meal was simple, humble, and warm. Emily's hand trembled slightly as she ladled soup into my bowl. I accepted it, smiling. Ryan poured water and began speaking, haltingly at first, about his work, about Grace practicing the piano. Each word felt like a thin thread stitching small, careful seams across the fabric of what had once been torn. I listened, not to correct, not to teach, just to hear the sound of their voices filling the room again. When Emily's hand brushed mine by accident, she froze. I placed my hand gently over hers, light as holding a new blossom. "You cook beautifully," I said. She swallowed, eyes shining. "Thank you, Mom." After a while, Ryan stood and drew open the curtain. Outside, the moon hung low, soft and full, pouring silver across the distant fields. The light fell over our faces, and in it I saw something I never thought I'd see again. Myself, my son, and the woman who once hurt me, now sitting together, not out of duty, but out of love that had been quietly cleansed. We didn't say the word forgiveness. We didn't have to. Sometimes forgiveness is nothing more than staying long enough to finish a meal together, without walking away halfway through. After dinner, Emily cleared the plates while Ryan brewed tea. He handed me a cup, and the scent of mint rose into the air, mingling with the whisper of wind along the porch. The little house wasn't grand or perfect, but it was warm. Warm in the way that tells a mother every step she's taken, every ache she's endured, was worth it. Before I left, I turned back. Ryan was switching off the lights, Emily folding the tablecloth. They spoke softly, not knowing I could still hear. "She looks happy, doesn't she?" Emily whispered. "Yeah," Ryan said, a smile in his voice. "For the first time. I think we all do." I stepped out onto the porch, drawing a deep breath. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of lavender and the lingering warmth of dinner. In my heart, I murmured, "Ethan, we did it." The afternoon light in Willow Creek was soft and golden, like honey poured over the fields. Cicadas hummed in the garden, and the scent of lavender drifted through the open window. I sat on the porch with a cup of mint tea in my hands, listening to Grace's laughter echoing from behind the house. She came running toward me, hair loose, cheeks flushed pink from the wind. Pulling up a chair beside mine, she climbed on and rested her chin on her palm. Sunlight spilled across her face, catching in her bright blue eyes. Eyes that always reminded me of both who I had been and who I had become. "Grandma," she asked suddenly, her voice clear and honest in the way only children can manage, "have you forgiven my mom and dad?" I set my cup down slowly. For a moment, even the air seemed to pause. The wind, the leaves, the faint hum of insects. Then I looked at her and smiled. "Forgiveness," I said, "is when you stop letting the pain drive you." Grace tilted her head, frowning in thought. "So, it means you don't forget, but you don't let it take the wheel anymore, right?" I couldn't help but laugh, surprised by the sharpness in her little question. "You're wiser than your years, Grace." She shrugged, her small shoulders lifting beneath a pale yellow sweater. "I just think if you stay mad all the time, you get tired. And if you're tired, you can't paint anything beautiful." I nodded slowly. "That's true. When you're angry, even blue starts to look sad." She grinned, a dimple deepening in her cheek. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small paint box. "Like when I make a mistake in my drawing," she said, "I just add another color, and it becomes a new picture." I looked at the paint box, then back at her, and in that small, sunlit moment, I realized I was learning an old lesson all over again, from an 8-year-old girl. "You know, Grace," I said softly, When I was young, I thought anything broken should be thrown away, but now I see some mistakes are meant to stay. They make the painting real. Grace nodded seriously, stirring her straw in a cup of orange juice. My art teacher says that too. He calls them happy mistakes. He says if you add the right color, nothing's ever ruined for good. I smiled, a quiet warmth rising in my chest, something light as a summer breeze, sweet and a little sad. You're right, my dear. Forgiveness works the same way. We can't erase what hurt us. We can only add a little color, understanding, so it doesn't scare us anymore. Grace studied me for a long moment, then nodded, with the calm of someone who already understood more than words could say. She dipped her tiny brush into the paint, and with a careful stroke, drew a thin, curved line across the back of my hand, a shade of soft turquoise. "This is the color of peace," she whispered. "I'm giving it to you." I looked at the mark, delicate, trembling, and alive, just like her hand. A small gift, but it held everything I'd been searching for: continuity, tenderness, and a future unafraid of what came before. We sat there for a long while, 2 generations, one who had survived the storm, and one who was just learning to watch the clouds. I took a sip of tea. The mint spread through my throat, cool and clear. In the murmur of the wind along the porch, I could almost hear my life closing its circle, not with a door slamming shut, but with the soft laughter of a child. I opened my arms and pulled her close. Grace's breath brushed my neck, warm and sweet with the scent of oranges. "That's right, my love," I whispered. "Grown-ups forget that sometimes. When we get older, we spend so much time trying to fix everything, trying to make it right, that we forget even the mistakes can be beautiful, if we look at them with love." Grace lifted her head, her blue eyes shining, and smiled, that bright, unguarded smile that made my heart tremble. She wrapped her small arms around my neck, holding tight, as if afraid I might dissolve into the breeze. I ran my fingers through her soft, tangled hair, feeling its warmth between my hands. By the kitchen doorway, Emily was standing, quiet, unnoticed until now. She leaned against the frame, the sunlight slipping through the curtains, painting her face in a pale golden hue. She said nothing, only watched us, and in the stillness, tears slid silently down her cheeks. Those weren't tears of guilt on Emily's face. They were the kind that come when someone finally sees what's right in the middle of everything that once went wrong. She covered her mouth, trying to hold back a sob, and whispered, "I've never seen you and Grace look so much alike." I turned toward her, smiling softly. "Maybe because we both like adding color to what's been broken." She laughed through her tears, a small, cracked, honest laugh. Then she came closer, sitting down beside Grace and me. In that moment, there was no line between the one who had caused pain and the one who had carried it. There were just 3 women, 3 generations, bathed in the tender gold of late afternoon. I poured more tea and handed her a cup. She took it carefully with both hands, bowing her head slightly. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to," I interrupted, my voice as light as the breeze drifting through the open window. "Sometimes, living differently is all the apology there needs to be." We fell quiet again. Outside, the lavender swayed gently, its scent floating through the air like a sigh. Grace rested her head on my lap, eyes closed, a faint smile still on her lips. Sunlight slipped through the window, falling over our hands, 3 of them layered together, my skin wrinkled and thin, Emily's still young, Grace's small and soft. But under that light, there was no difference, only warmth and life and the pulse of love finding its way back after years apart. Every wound was quietly healed in that gentle glow, not by loud apologies or dramatic tears, but by an honest silence, the kind filled with understanding. Outside, the sun was sinking. The gold of afternoon deepened into rose, then faded into violet. A breeze slipped through, stirring the curtains, and for a moment I could almost feel Ethan near, watching us, smiling, content that love had finally returned to this house. Grace stirred and opened her eyes, blinking. "Grandma," she whispered, "can I paint tomorrow? I want to paint the three of us." "Of course," I said, smiling, "but don't forget the turquoise, the color of peace." "I won't," she promised, grinning before running out into the yard. Emily watched her go, still holding her cup, her voice rough with emotion. "I was so afraid I'd lose this chance," she said softly. "Thank you for still being here." I placed my hand over hers. "We've all lost something, Emily. But the miracle is, if we still dare to love, nothing is ever truly gone." She nodded, her lips trembling into a teary smile. I looked up. The sun was almost gone beyond the hill, its final light spilling across the table, touching the 3 cups of tea still warm, their steam rising together like a quiet blessing. And in my heart, something melted, tender, light, and achingly real. The morning of my 63rd birthday began with the faint smell of baking bread and sunlight slipping through the curtains like silk. The little house in Willow Creek now woke each day to birdsong, to Grace's giggles, and to lavender blossoms swaying on the porch. I brewed a cup of mint tea and set it on the table. The rising steam curled in the air. That scent always reminded me that I was still alive, truly living, not just existing. On the table lay a pale yellow envelope with handwriting I knew by heart. "To Mom, for your next canvas." Inside was a plane ticket and a photo of Tuscany, rolling vineyards under gold light, and the words, "Art Retreat for Beginners." Ryan stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, looking both proud and unsure, like a boy who wasn't certain if his gift was the right one. I wasn't sure if you'd want to travel that far," he said, "but I thought maybe you should. Grace said Grandma needs new colors." I laughed softly. Grace is always right. He smiled, eyes glistening with the kind of tenderness that still caught me off guard. Even at 36, he still had flashes of that small, fragile boy who once believed love meant doing everything right, now learning that love means giving someone the freedom to be themselves. He stepped closer and handed me a small card. Emily's handwriting, gentle and careful, read, "From all of us, because you taught us what love actually means." I looked up to find her standing by the kitchen counter, smiling, a smile real and easy, without the weight of fear or apology. Ryan placed a hand on my shoulder. "Mom," he said quietly, voice rough but steady. "Thank you for never giving up on us." The words brushed against my heart like a breeze, soft, healing, enough to mend what time alone could not. I looked at him, this man who had once broken me, now the same man teaching me that tenderness is another form of strength. I squeezed his hand. "Thank you for learning how to love." He smiled back, and the morning light fell across his face, familiar, yet calm in a way I had never seen before. We sat together at the table. Emily poured the tea, and Grace danced around us, humming a little birthday tune. No big cake, no candles, just 3 generations gathered in one warm room, with the scent of mint drifting through the light. I lifted my cup, tapped it gently against Grace's glass of orange juice. The soft clink sounded like a heartbeat. To new beginnings, I said. To Grandma's next painting, Grace cheered. Laughter rippled through the room. For a moment, everything felt simple and whole. I glanced again at the ticket, not because the journey ahead thrilled me, but because it reminded me that there are still things worth seeing, worth painting, worth waking up for. I used to think 63 was the age to rest. Now I see it's the age when you finally begin to see the true colors of your life. A soft breeze drifted through the window, carrying with it the mingled scent of lavender and mint tea. I traced the rim of my cup with my fingertip and closed my eyes. Inside, I whispered to Ethan, "Do you see them, love? They've learned how to love, just as you always hoped." A beam of sunlight slipped through the curtain, warm, smooth, alive. When I opened my eyes, they were all still there, laughter twining with birdsong. The room glowed, not from the lamps, but from something wordless, the quiet certainty that we had truly found our way back to one another. The next morning, the breeze carried the scent of lavender from the garden into the room. The sun was low, scattering gold across the floorboards like drops of honey. Everyone else was still asleep. The house was still, filled only with the ticking of the clock and the soft tapping of a bird against the window. I sat by the window, the ticket to Tuscany still open on the table beside my steaming cup of mint tea. When the light grew stronger, I placed the cup and my silver key on the windowsill. Two small things that had followed me through every season. One, a reminder of calm. The other, that any door can open if you're brave enough to turn the lock. Now, I didn't need them to hold on to anything. I just wanted them to rest in the morning light. A quiet farewell to all the years behind me. I touched the rim of the cup. It was still warm. Sunlight caught the silver key, scattering a thin thread of light, fragile yet steady, like me. I thought of it all. The long nights in the old house, the words never spoken, the letters never sent. The hours spent waiting for a call that never came. Now, those memories rose and faded like tea steam, no longer choking, no longer heavy. Outside, Grace ran down the porch steps, clutching her paint box. She looked up toward the window, smiling. "Grandma, today I'm painting the sky." I smiled back. "Then add a little sunlight, so the sky won't feel lonely." She nodded eagerly and dashed off, her laughter scattering through the air. I sat there quietly, watching the sky brighten. Thin clouds drifted by, soft as silk. A gentle wind lifted the white curtain, carrying with it the faint whisper of life, a heartbeat, a breath, a continuation. And then, softly, I spoke. Not loudly, not for anyone else to hear. Just a private vow to the parts of me that had once been hurt, lost, and hollow. At last, I'm home, inside my own heart. The words lingered in me like the final note of a song, warm, tender, and real. Outside, Ryan opened the door. Emily poured coffee, and Grace bent over her drawing, brushing strokes of turquoise across the paper. Sunlight bathed them all, and for a moment, they looked radiant. 3 figures held in the gentle frame of Willow Creek. There was nothing more I needed. No grand closure. No apology, no victory. Just the sight of the people I love living honestly. That was enough. I reached for a piece of paper and wrote a few lines, not to anyone else, but to myself. If one day you grow tired, sit down and make a cup of mint tea. Its scent will remind you that peace isn't a place. It's the moment you stop running from yourself. I folded the note and placed it beside the key. The morning light poured across the table, bright and whole, filling the room with quiet gold. And somewhere, I knew, Ethan was smiling. Outside, the wind moved gently through the garden. Lavender swayed, releasing its calm perfume. I closed my eyes, breathing deeply, as if the whole world were breathing with me. There was nothing left to prove, nothing left to hold. Only a 63-year-old woman sitting in the sunlight, watching the morning touch her hands, and smiling, knowing that the journey home had always been a journey inward. My story, I suppose, comes to an end here. But sometimes, what truly matters isn't how it ends. It's that we found the courage to look back, to forgive, and to love once more. If you've ever sat in silence, wishing someone could understand you without words, tell me your story. Because maybe we're all searching for the same thing: peace. And don't forget to subscribe, so that each time a new story begins, you'll still be here with me, to sit down and share another cup of mint tea together.